People ask me sometimes, they ask why we had to go, why we had to fight, why it was worth what we paid for it. And I understand the question, I really do. It's a fair question to ask. But the thing is, when you live through it, when you're actually there, it wasn't complicated, at least not in the way people make it complicated now. I mean, I understand the complicated part, I do. But right then, in 1941, in 1942, in 1943, it was simple. See, the Germans, Hitler, and all of them, they had a different idea about how the world should be. Not just a different idea, a dangerous one. I didn't read all the newspapers and the political magazines and all that. I was a farm boy. My father worked. My mother worked. We didn't have much, but we knew enough. We knew what was happening over there. My father had a radio, an old radio with a dial you'd turn, and we'd listen to the news. We'd hear about the things the Germans were doing, not just the fighting part, the other part, the way they treated people who weren't like them, the way they were taking over countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, just walking in and taking what wasn't theirs. And then Japan. Japan was doing the same thing, taking over China, the Philippines. Expansion. That's what they called it, I think. But it was conquest. It was imperialism. It was the strong just stomping on the weak because they could. I remember talking to my father about it. I must have been 17 or 18. And he said, son, there's going to be a reckoning. He said it like he knew, like he'd seen this pattern before, which I guess he had. He was older, had lived through the first war. He said, this can't stand. The world won't let it stand. But at first we didn't join. America didn't join. I remember that too. There was a lot of people who said we shouldn't fight, who said it wasn't our business, who said we should stay out of it. And I understood that too. War costs, war kills, war changes things. It's not something you want. But then Pearl Harbor happened. December 7th, 1941. I was listening to the radio when they announced it. Japanese planes coming out of nowhere and bombing our ships, killing our sailors, killing boys who were just doing their jobs. And it was like something shifted in the whole country, shifted in me too, because at that point it wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't about what we should do or what was right or wrong. It was about defending ourselves, defending our country, our home, and that made sense. That was clear. When somebody attacks you, you defend yourself. That's not complicated. I enlisted about 3 months after that. I didn't have to. I could have waited to be drafted, but I didn't want to wait. I was young and I was angry, and I thought I could make a difference. I thought if I didn't go, then somebody else would have to. And I knew how to work, knew how to handle myself, figured I could do my part. My mother cried when I told her. I remember that very clearly. She cried, but she didn't try to stop me. She just held me for a while and then let me go, because she knew it too, knew why it had to be done. Now, once I got into it, once I actually got to the war, that's when you see more complicated things. You see things that make you question. You see things you don't want to see. I've talked about some of that, about the killing, about the civilians, about mistakes that happened, about things that weren't right. But that doesn't change the fundamental thing. That doesn't change the fact that we had to fight, because the alternative was letting them win, letting Hitler and the Nazis run Europe, letting Japan take over Asia and the Pacific. And I don't think that would have been a better world. I think it would have been a much worse world. I didn't have all the historical information then. Didn't know everything the Nazis were doing. I mean, you heard rumors, but you don't really know. Not until after, not until the camps were liberated and you saw what they'd actually done, what they'd done to the Jews, to the gypsies, to anybody they decided wasn't worthy. When I found out what the camps were like, and I didn't see them myself, but I heard from people who did. When I found out what they'd actually been doing, that's when you realize, that's when you know you were right. You had to fight. There was no other choice that made sense. But even before you knew the details, even before you saw the proof, you could feel it. You could feel that something was deeply wrong. The way the Germans operated, the way they treated people. They weren't just fighting a war. They were trying to change the world, change it into something darker, something more brutal, something less human. And we couldn't let that happen. I've thought about this a lot over the years. Had time to think when I got older. Had time to read history and understand the bigger picture. And I don't regret it. I regret what it cost. I regret the men we lost. I regret that it had to be that violent. But I don't regret that we fought. Because the world that would have existed if we hadn't, I don't think it would have been a place I'd want to live in. My children grew up in a free country. They grew up with choices, with opportunities. They could be whatever they wanted to be, say whatever they wanted to say, think whatever they wanted to think. That wasn't guaranteed. That was something we had to fight for. And I've seen what happens in countries where they don't have that. After the war, I paid attention to the Soviet Union, to China, to the places that went the other way. I saw what happened to people who didn't have freedom, how they were controlled, how they were afraid. And I thought we saved ourselves from that. We saved our country from that. That was worth something. Now, I'm not saying America's perfect. I'm not saying we were perfect even then. We had problems. We had injustices. I knew colored soldiers, black soldiers, and the way they were treated, that wasn't right. That wasn't fair. The way some people were excluded, the way some weren't full citizens, that's something we had to fix after. And we did. Slowly, not fast enough, but we did. And we could do that because we were free, because we had the ability to look at ourselves and say, this isn't right. We need to change it. That's not something you get to do under a dictatorship. That's something you only get to do when you have freedom. So I guess what I'm saying is we had to fight because the alternative was unacceptable. Not just to us, to the world. The Nazis couldn't be allowed to win. Japan couldn't be allowed to take over the Pacific. It would have been a different world, a darker world, a less free world. Did we know all of that at the time? Not completely. Not the way you understand it now. But we knew enough. We knew something was deeply wrong and it had to be stopped. And we were strong enough to stop it. So we did. I was at a school once talking to the kids. A teacher invited me to come in and talk about the war. And one of the kids asked me, do you wish you hadn't gone? And I told him, no, I don't. I wish there hadn't been a war. I wish we hadn't had to fight, but we did have to. And I went, and I'm not sorry about that. And he asked me, do you think it would be different now if America hadn't fought? And I told him, yes. I think it would be very different. I think we'd be living in a world controlled by people who didn't believe in freedom, who didn't believe people should have choices, who believed some people were better than others because of who they were born to be. And that kid, he was maybe 13, 14. He nodded like he understood. And I hope he did. I hope all those kids did, because that's what we have to remember. Not just the fighting part, not just the heroic part or the exciting part, but the reason why it mattered. A lot of people want to make the war something it wasn't. They want to make it glorious, heroic, noble, And there was some of that. There were brave people doing brave things. There were sacrifices that meant something. But a lot of it was just terrible, just brutal and cruel and wrong. And if we're going to remember the war, we have to remember both the heroism and the horror. But underneath both of those things was this basic truth. We had to fight because the world couldn't survive another way. Because freedom couldn't survive if we didn't fight. And we knew that. We felt that. Even if we couldn't articulate it perfectly. Even if we didn't have all the information. We knew it. My father was right. There was a reckoning. There had to be. And when it came time for me to be part of that reckoning, I went. I was scared. I was untrained. I was just a farm boy from Oklahoma. But I went because somebody had to, because I was strong enough to try, because I was free and I wanted to stay that way. And I wanted my children to be free too. Wanted them to have choices. Wanted them to live in a world where they weren't told what to think and who to be. That's what we were fighting for. Not for glory or medals or any of that. We were fighting for freedom, for the idea that people should be able to live their own lives, make their own choices, think their own thoughts. That's a powerful thing. Powerful enough to fight for, powerful enough to die for. And I think we knew that, or at least we believed it, even if we didn't always say it out loud. I've talked to some of the younger generation, and they ask, don't you think America could have done something else? Wasn't there a peaceful solution? And I understand why they ask that. War's terrible. Peace is better. Everybody knows that. But sometimes peace isn't an option. Sometimes the other side won't negotiate. Sometimes they just keep taking and taking until you have no choice but to stand and fight. That's where we were. That's where the world was. Germany wanted Europe. Japan wanted Asia and the Pacific. And if we didn't fight, they would have taken it. Simple as that. No peace was possible with them. Not on terms that would have been acceptable. Not if we valued freedom. So we fought, and a lot of people died. And a lot of people were wounded. And a lot of people came home and had to live with what they'd seen. That's the cost. That's what we paid. But I still think it was the right choice. I still think we had to do it because the alternative was worse. I'm old now. I'm 94, 95 years old. And I've had a long time to think about this, to look back and ask myself, was it worth it? Did we do the right thing? And my answer is yes. Yes, we did the right thing. Not the easy thing, the right thing. The world changed because of that war. It became freer in some ways, more complex in other ways, but freer. Especially here in America, we proved that we could stand against tyranny, prove that freedom was worth fighting for, prove that ordinary people, farm boys and factory workers and shoeshine boys, could do something extraordinary when they had to, could stand up against something much bigger and darker than themselves and say, no, this will not stand, not on our watch. I just hope people remember that. Not just the battles and the dates and the generals, but the reason, the fundamental reason why it had to be done. Because that reason, it doesn't go away. It's still relevant now, still true. Freedom is still something worth fighting for, still something we have to think about, still something we have to protect. That's what that war taught me. That's what I want people to know. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about adventure. It was about protecting something precious, something we almost lost, something we can still lose if we're not careful. And that's why it had to be fought. That's why it was worth it. Even with all the cost, even with all the pain. God bless those who didn't come home. God bless those who did come home and had to live with what they'd seen. And God bless America for standing up, for being free, for believing that was worth fighting for. Because it absolutely was.